This is video lecture 18.1, Adjectives, Pronouns, and Numerals of the first and third declension. In this chapter, the author of your textbook groups together adjectives, pronouns, and numbers that follow the third declension, for the most part, in the masculine and the neuter, and the first declension in the feminine. That sounds a little odd in the abstract, but when we look at a number of charts, it'll make more sense. So let's look here first at the chart for the word meaning all, every, or whole. This is the word pos or pon. I highly recommend that you memorize this word, not just the masculine form, but you memorize pos, posa, pon, pontos. That'll make more sense about why we're memorizing that way in a moment. But I want you to memorize pos, posa. If I say, what is the word for all, every, or whole, right? All, every, or whole. And if we put the cookies on the very bottom shelf, you say, well, how do I know which way to translate it? Well, which one works? Ask yourself in the context, which of these meanings makes the most sense? And then go with that. We'll refine that a bit more in just a moment. I want you to note here we have the singular, we have the plural. You're used to this pattern. We have the nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative. And then we have the masculine, feminine, neuter in the singular and the masculine, feminine, neuter in the plural. And what we're saying here is that the masculine and the neuter, both in the singular and in the plural, the masculine and the neuter, follow third declension type patterns, and the feminine, do a different color here, the feminine in the singular and the plural follow a first declension type pattern. So we're going to call that a 3-1-3 pattern. These are 3-1-3 adjectives, numbers, and pronouns. 3-1-3. 3-1-3 because they follow the third declension in the masculine, the third declension in the neuter, and the first declension in the feminine. That's one reason that we're memorizing these initial four forms. We're memorizing pos, posa, pon, pontos. We're having to memorize that because we need to get the genitive form pontos that gives us the stem. Remember, to get the stem of a third declension noun, you have to get the genitive, and then you cut the os off of the genitive, and that's the stem that the rest of the word builds off of to be able to recognize that word. If you'll look, in fact, if you'll look here, you'll see that the pont, there's our stem. If we cut the os off, pontos, and then we have pont, 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 pont. Here, dative plural, we expect some difficulty, and the tau dropped off. We have the nu in the tau that dropped off there when the sigma was added in, but possen, and then pontos. If you'll look at those endings, you'll recognize that we're following third declension endings. Os, iota, alpha, s, own, sin, os. And then for the neuter, you say, well, I don't have to memorize something else for the neuter right here. We don't have to memorize that pontos again because we already have the stem, the same stem that it builds off of in the masculine. So if we look, the stem here is pont, 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 pont. Again, the dative plural, we're not surprised that we have a little bit of complexity there where something dropped off. Plural dates are always complex. We're also not worried about this neuter singular because once we have the nominative form, we have the accusative form. They're always mirror images of each other. And then note these endings: os, iota, alpha, own, sin, and alpha, the regular third declension endings. Compare this, if you will, with the feminine. And when you look at the feminine, we're just memorizing that posa, and then we see it's like the word doxa, and you don't really have to worry about that. You just have to recognize it. It follows the same endings as hemera or as phone or doxe, some combination of those. It's like the ace, a, on, I, own, ice, os. So if you look back, it's just like the noun doxa, which is a hybrid of hemera and phone. The only difference, again, between this and, say, hemera, is that in the singular, it follows an alpha, eta, eta, alpha pattern. In the plural, it's completely regular with alpha. I am not going to ask you to write out these charts. You just need to be able to recognize these. You do, however, need to have memorized 4 forms and expect to have to write these on a quiz. You need to be able to write out pas, pasapon, pantas. Pas, pasapon, pantas. Please memorize those 4 forms and just take a little time to get out a highlighter, kind of look at the chart and see how the words decline and the different genders and numbers, and just get a little more comfortable with that. This is not a hard word to recognize. You notice most of the forms here have a pont in them, and many of you are familiar with the word pan used in some way, like, for example, pantheist. A pantheist is someone who believes every visible material thing has God in it in some way. So from the Greek word theos, God, and pan, every or whole, a pantheist is someone who worships nature and themselves and whatever the case may be. And there's other words, panmillennial, other words, English words that build off of this Greek root of pan or pan, that will help you remember what that word means. We said that the word pas, pasapon, pantas can mean all, every, or whole. And again, just go with whichever one fits. But if we want a little bit more guidance on that, you'll notice in the textbook there is a regular pattern that's followed here, and I'll write out just a few examples. So we have pasa he polis is translated pasa pe polis is translated all the city. And it's nice because the order of the English is the same as the order of the Greek. In other words, the word for all, the article, and then the noun, we'll see that continue in this pattern. So when the Greek noun has the article and the modifying adjective pas does not, then it often means all. That is when the word pas occurs in the predicate position. Predicate position just means the noun has the article, pas does not. Then we have he pasa polis. That is called the attributive position, where the adjective has the article, the noun may or may not. And the normal rendering in this case is with the meaning whole. The whole city. The whole city. And I want you to note again that the word order of the English, article, adjective, noun, article, adjective, noun, follows the same order in Greek and English, which may help you remember that. And then if there is no article with either word, for example, passapalis, then normally the word pas will be translated with every city. That's a regular pattern, but context is more important than the pattern. And again, putting the cookies on the very, very bottom shelf, whenever you run into pas in its various permutations, it probably means all, every, or whole, and you just kind of see which one of those will work based on the context. Another word that he gives you in this chapter is the word for one, the number 1. You never knew the number 1 could be so complex, did you? And you'll notice that it has a feminine form, it has a masculine form, a feminine form, and a neuter form, and it declines, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, because the word 1 is often going to be taken modifying another noun, and so it has to be able to match that noun in its case, gender and number. Someone's wondering, well, where are the plural forms of 1? Where are the plural forms of 1? And someone else is smacking them on the back of the head and saying, 1 doesn't have plural forms. 1 is always singular, and that person is right. What I want you to memorize here is I want you to memorize heis, mia, hen, henas. If you memorize heis, mia, hen, henas, then you'll remember this is a 3-1-3 pattern, following third declension in the masculine, first declension in the feminine, third declension in the neuter. We are also memorizing that initial genitive form so that we get the stem we get the stem hen, right there. We get the stem hen that the word continues to build off of. If we didn't memorize that, we really probably would have trouble recognizing the dative through the accusative forms in the masculine and the neuter. So please memorize and note that it is haste with a rough breathing mark, and it is hen with a rough breathing mark, and henas with a rough breathing mark. Haste, mia, hen, henas. So after you study this, I say, hey, what's the Greek word for one? The number one. I want you to be able to, just like a reflex, say haste, mia, hen, henas. And remind yourself as you say that. One reason we're memorizing that way, so you remember it follows a 3-1-3. Third declension in the masculine, first declension in the feminine, third declension in the neuter. In the textbook, he also points out that the negation word no one follows this same pattern. And so the word for no one, oudes, oudemia, ouden, and that's given in the vocabulary, but haste is one, oudes is no one, and if it's in the non-indicative mood, it's medes. So we have, again, these are listed in the vocabulary, but these follow the same pattern as the word haste, one. Medes, no one for the non-indicative moods, and oudes, no one for the indicative moods. And they also, listed in the vocabulary, have a feminine and a neuter form. In the chapter, he also gives you the word palus and megas. He's just throwing in a few extra adjectives here. These don't consistently follow a 3-1-3 pattern. These are really more of a first and second declension pattern for the most part, but we have a few unusual forms, and he's like, well, these are common adjectives. They have a few unusual forms, so I'm just going to throw them in here. So one of these adjectives is the word palus, which means much or many. And I want you to note that over here and we have both the singular and the plural forms of this. I don't think I have these loaded into but in your textbook you can see the plural forms are completely regular. They're completely regular with first and second declension endings, just like hemera, just like doron, just like anthropos, completely regular. In the singular, there are really only 8 forms, 4 in the singular and 4 in the plural, that deviate slightly from the first and second declension endings. And those are underlined in your book. I just highlighted them on the sheet. So if we were to erase these 4 forms, and we're focusing first here on palus, so we're really only talking about four forms for palus. If we were to erase the 4 forms I just highlighted, the word would be completely regular. The stem of it would be pal with 2 lambdas, and then it would follow first and second declension endings. If you look through the singular plural, you see, hey, that's completely regular. But we do have a few little unusual things, and so it might be wise of you to memorize this word as palus, pale, palu. And if you memorize it that way, it reminds you that you have a couple, actually 4 irregularities, but then usually you're going to be building off this stem. Palus, pale, palu. If you memorize the word in that way, that's really sufficient, just taking a little bit of time looking over the chart. And then the other adjective here that he gives you is the word megas. Think about mega market or something like that. Megas means great. So megas means great. And it might be a good idea again to memorize those initial 3 forms, megas, megale, mega, realizing that almost every form in the chart is going to build off of the stem for megale, off the megal stem, but there's a few irregularities, and so megas, megale, mega, if you memorize that, then you should be in good shape. Hopefully for palus, you recognize a root there that will help you remember that. For example, in English, you may remember in geometry a polygon. A polygon is a many-sided figure. Polytheism is the belief in many gods. So use your English cognates as much as you can. Remember, in this chapter, just step back for a second. We're focusing on recognition, memorizing the first 3 or the first 4 forms in a chart, and not being thrown off by the minor changes that take place. There's another word, another adjective, aletheis, meaning true. And for this word, I just really recommend that you memorize the initial 2 forms, or maybe the 3rd form there if you want. Aletheis, alethes, alethus. And that will hopefully remind you that this adjective has a masculine/feminine set of endings, really a 3rd declension, and then a neuter set of endings that it follows. 2 sets of endings depending on if it's modifying a masculine/feminine or a neuter. This is again the adjective meaning true. So just memorizing those initial forms and then kind of looking and saying, oh, this is kind of like ethnos, ethnus, like 3rd declension endings for the masculine, feminine, and in the neuter. It's really throughout. Sometimes this is called a 3rd declension adjective because it consistently follows 3rd declension endings. Aletheis, alethes, alethus, the adjective for true. Another thing that David Allen Black deals with in this chapter is the different degrees of an adjective. The degrees of an adjective. You do this all the time in English. You just don't think about it. Something is sweet, or maybe you compare it, and it may be sweeter than something else, or maybe it's the sweetest thing you've ever tasted. And those degrees of the adjective, sweet is the positive degree, sweeter is the comparative, and sweetest is the superlative. The superlative. Now, in Koine Greek, the period of Greek that we're studying of the New Testament, the superlative degree of the adjective is not especially common. And when it's used, it often has what's called an elative sense. An elative, which means it's translated very, very, rather than really comparing several different things and saying it's the top of it. So, and in Koine Greek, the comparative adjective, in certain contexts, can communicate a superlative sense. So context is most important in figuring out what the comparative and the superlative forms of the adjectives are. If you look at the chart that's been scanned in from your textbook here, you can see the common comparative and superlative endings. So here's an adjective, the positive degree of the adjective, dikaios. Then you have this ending added, teros, that's the comparative. Here, look, teros, teros, teros. And those endings can be, the very end of that word can be changed to follow masculine, feminine, or neuter endings in a 1st or 2nd declension type pattern. Teros, tere, teron, following. Let's just make sure that I'm being clear on that. So, for example, dikaiateros, if we were comparing something feminine, we could say dikaiatera, or something neuter, dikaiateron, and also it can decline with the different endings, dikaiateron, dikaiateru, dikaiatero, and so follow those different case endings that we've learned. The comparative ending teros may be easier for you to remember if you notice the ER sound there in the middle, which is very much like the comparative ER in English. Something is sweeter. It's sweeter. And so we have an ER, or epsilon rho, in the comparative ending for the Greek. The superlative ending is tatas. So tatas, 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 and tatas. And so that is translated then as the most of something. Another superlative ending that's not listed here in this chart is istas. So sometimes you'll find the superlative ending as istas, which, again, as for memory sakes, is nice because it sounds a lot like the superlative ending in English. Highest, istas, highest. And you'll note your book also points out that in Greek there are a number of common adjectives who have irregular comparatives. In other words, if you were to come to the adjective agathos, and I say, what is the comparative of agathos? You'd say, oh, I know what that is. Agathos is agathoteros. And I would say, and you would say, well, what is it? And we'd say, creson. And you would put your hands on your forehead and put your head down and just want to give up. But it's how the same thing's happening in English. We don't say something is good, gooder. At least most of us don't. Good, gooder, and goodest, do we? Unless we're 2 years old. We say something is good, better, or best. And so we see in English, as in Greek, common words often have irregular forms. So the positive degree of the adjective, the comparative degree irregular, and the superlative degree irregular. So here we have kakos means bad. The comparative worse is kairon. Megas is great. The comparative maidzone is greater. Palus is much. Pleon is more. And I would recommend that you try to focus on recognizing. Of course, if it's in the vocabulary, you have to learn it, but focus on being able to recognize those irregular forms of the comparative adjective. This is video lecture 18.1, Adjectives, Pronouns, and Numerals of the first and third declension.